March the 9th, 1945. Major General Curtis LeMay stood in the operations room at Guam Air Base, watching the last of 334 B-29 superfortresses disappear into the darkness over the Pacific. In 12 hours, these bombers would return having executed the single, deadliest air raid in human history. They would have killed more people in one night than the atomic bombs would kill at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They would have burned 16 square miles of Tokyo to ash and left over 1 million Japanese civilians homeless. But perhaps most importantly, they would have shattered the Japanese government's belief that they could survive an extended war against American industrial might. What LeMay didn't know as he watched those bombers fade into the night was that he had just launched the campaign that would ultimately convince Emperor Hirohito himself that continued resistance meant the complete annihilation of Japanese civilization. The firebombing of Japan wasn't just a military operation, it was a demonstration of American industrial capacity so overwhelming that it forced Japanese leaders to confront an impossible mathematical reality. They could not defend their cities, they could not protect their people, they could not maintain war production under this level of systematic destruction. The story of how America's firebombing campaign brought Japan to its knees begins not with the famous raid on Tokyo, but with a fundamental shift in American strategic thinking. For months, American bombers had been conducting precision daylight raids against Japanese industrial targets. The results were catastrophically disappointing. High-altitude bombing in Japan faced obstacles that hadn't existed in Europe. Japan's powerful jet stream winds at 30,000 feet pushed bombers past their targets before accurate bombing was possible. Dense cloud cover obscured targets for weeks at a time. Most critically, Japanese war production wasn't concentrated in massive factories like German industry. Instead, it was dispersed across thousands of small workshops embedded in residential neighborhoods throughout Japanese cities. American bombing accuracy was so poor that military planners calculated it would take decades to destroy Japanese industrial capacity using precision methods. Meanwhile, Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft defenses were inflicting unacceptable losses on American bomber formations. Something had to change, or the war in the Pacific would drag on indefinitely. The man who changed everything was Curtis LeMay, a 38-year-old general who had earned his reputation in the skies over Germany. LeMay had watched precision bombing succeed in Europe, but he understood that Japan required completely different tactics. The solution, he realized, lay not in precision, but in area destruction. If Japanese industry was scattered throughout residential areas, then destroying the residential areas would destroy the industry. If small workshops couldn't be targeted individually, then entire neighborhoods containing those workshops would have to be eliminated. But LeMay's strategy went far beyond simply changing targets. He was proposing to revolutionize the fundamental nature of strategic bombing itself. Instead of high-altitude daylight precision raids, LeMay planned low-altitude nighttime area attacks using incendiary weapons designed specifically to create uncontrollable fires. Instead of heavily defended bombers carrying small payloads, he would strip defensive armaments from his aircraft to maximize their load of firebombs. Instead of attacking military targets, he would deliberately target densely populated civilian areas where war production was concentrated. The decision to implement this strategy was controversial even within American military leadership. Many officers understood that LeMay was proposing to burn Japanese cities and their inhabitants as a primary objective, not as collateral damage. LeMay himself reportedly said, "If we lose the war, we'll be tried as war criminals." But the alternative was a prolonged war that would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives in a planned invasion of Japan. The mathematics of warfare demanded the most efficient path to victory. The technical preparations for the firebombing campaign revealed the terrifying scale of American industrial capacity. Beginning in 1943, American factories had ramped up production of napalm from 500,000 pounds annually to 8 million pounds by 1944. Specialized incendiary bombs called M69s were manufactured by the millions. These weapons used napalm as their filler and were designed to create fires that spread faster than they could be extinguished. 38 M69 incendiaries were packed into each E-46 cluster bomb, which would scatter the smaller bombs across a wide area upon release. American military planners had conducted extensive research to understand how to most effectively destroy Japanese cities. At the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, they had constructed exact replicas of typical Japanese residential buildings using the same wood and paper construction methods. They tested various incendiary weapons against these structures until they found the optimal combination for creating massive, uncontrollable fires. These tests proved that Japanese urban construction was uniquely vulnerable to incendiary attack. The predominant use of wood and paper in residential buildings meant that fires would spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods once started. By early 1945, massive stockpiles of incendiary bombs were accumulating at American air bases in the Mariana Islands. The logistics alone were staggering. Each bombing mission required hundreds of tons of incendiary weapons to be loaded onto dozens of aircraft. Supply ships crossed the Pacific carrying nothing but firebombs, destined for Japanese cities. The scale of preparation indicated that this would not be a limited campaign, but a sustained assault designed to systematically destroy Japan's urban infrastructure. The target selection process revealed the methodical nature of American planning. Intelligence analysts had mapped Japanese cities in extraordinary detail, identifying not just military targets, but residential areas that contained small-scale war production. They had calculated population densities, studied fire department capabilities, analysed building materials and construction patterns. They knew which cities would burn most effectively, and which contained the highest concentrations of war-related industry embedded in civilian neighbourhoods. Tokyo was chosen as the first target not only because it was Japan's capital, but because American intelligence estimated that over 50% of the city's war production was scattered throughout residential areas. Destroying these neighbourhoods would cripple Japanese manufacturing, while demonstrating to the Japanese government that no part of their country was safe from American attack. The psychological impact was considered as important as the physical destruction. On the night of March 9, 1945, LeMay's revolutionary strategy was put to the test. The 334 B-29s approaching Tokyo carried over 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs. Unlike previous raids, these bombers would attack from altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, flying through Japanese anti-aircraft fire to ensure accuracy. The lead aircraft would drop their bombs in a large X pattern over Tokyo's densely populated eastern districts. Following bombers would simply aim for the fires already burning, creating a concentrated inferno that would spread throughout the target area. The Japanese defenders were completely unprepared for this type of attack. Their fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns were positioned to intercept high-altitude daylight raids. The sudden appearance of hundreds of low-flying bombers at night caught them off guard. Japanese fire departments had procedures for dealing with scattered incendiary bombs from conventional raids, but they had no plan for the coordinated area attack that was about to engulf their city. At 12:07 a.m. on March 10th, the first B-29s reached Tokyo and began dropping their incendiary loads over the targeted residential districts. Within minutes, individual fires began coalescing into a general conflagration that would soon consume 16 square miles of the city. The M69 incendiaries worked exactly as designed, spraying burning napalm that adhered to buildings and spread fires faster than they could be controlled. What happened next exceeded even LeMay's expectations for destruction. The fires created their own weather system, generating massive updrafts powerful enough to flip heavy bombers that flew too close. Surface temperatures reached levels that literally vaporized human beings caught in the open. The firestorm moved through residential neighborhoods faster than people could flee, creating scenes of unimaginable horror as entire families were trapped in their homes or incinerated while attempting to escape. Japanese fire brigades rushed to combat the blazes but found their efforts completely futile. The fires were too large, too hot, and spreading too rapidly for conventional firefighting methods. Fire trucks were abandoned as crews fled for their lives. Water mains burst from the heat, eliminating water pressure just when it was most desperately needed. The systematic nature of the attack meant that fires were starting simultaneously across a wide area, making coordinated firefighting impossible. By dawn, the destruction was beyond comprehension. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash and rubble. American intelligence estimates suggested that over 100,000 people had died in a single night, making this the deadliest air raid in human history. Over 1 million Japanese civilians were homeless, wandering through the ruins carrying what few possessions they could salvage. The eastern districts of Tokyo, which had housed 1.2 million people, had essentially ceased to exist. But the human cost was only part of the story. The strategic impact was even more devastating for Japan's war effort. The destroyed neighborhoods had contained thousands of small workshops that produced critical components for Japanese military equipment. Machine parts, electronics, precision instruments, aircraft components, all of this decentralized production had been eliminated in a single night. American intelligence calculated that Tokyo's war production had been cut in half by this one raid. The Japanese government's initial response revealed their shock at the scale of destruction. Official reports struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could 300 aircraft destroy 16 square miles of their capital city in a few hours? The damage exceeded anything in Japanese experience, surpassing even the Great Tokyo earthquake of 1923. Government officials toured the devastated areas and found entire neighborhoods that had been completely erased, leaving only ash-covered foundations where thousands of homes and businesses had stood. Emperor Hirohito himself toured the destroyed areas on March 18th. This was unprecedented. The emperor rarely involved himself directly in military affairs, but the devastation in his capital demanded imperial attention. What he saw during this tour would fundamentally alter his thinking about Japan's ability to continue the war. Entire districts had been reduced to wasteland. Survivors wandered aimlessly through the ruins. The smell of death and destruction hung over vast areas of his capital city. For Hirohito, this tour represented a moment of terrible clarity. American bombers had demonstrated that they could destroy Japanese cities at will. If this level of destruction could be inflicted in a single night, what would happen over months of sustained bombing? The mathematical implications were inescapable. Japan could not defend its cities against this type of attack, and without cities there could be no war production, no government, no functioning society. The success of the Tokyo raid convinced LeMay that his strategy was correct, but it also revealed the true scope of the task ahead. Tokyo was just one city. Japan had dozens of major urban areas that would need to be systematically destroyed to cripple the country's war-making capacity. The March 9th raid had proven that American industrial capacity could produce the weapons needed for this campaign. Now it was simply a matter of methodical execution. Within days of the Tokyo Inferno, LeMay's staff was already planning the next phase of what would become the most systematic urban destruction campaign in military history. The success of Operation Meeting House had validated every assumption about Japan's vulnerability to incendiary attack. Japanese cities weren't just flammable, they were catastrophically defenseless against coordinated area bombing. The question was no longer whether American bombers could destroy Japanese urban centers, but how quickly they could eliminate them all. The target list was extensive and methodical. Nagoya, Japan's third largest city and a major aircraft manufacturing center, was selected for the next major raid. Osaka, the industrial heart of Western Japan, would follow. Kobe, with its critical port facilities and shipbuilding industry, was marked for destruction. Yokohama, Tokyo's neighboring port city, would be systematically burned. The planners weren't selecting targets randomly. They were working through a carefully prioritized list designed to maximize both physical destruction and psychological impact on Japanese leadership. But the expansion of the firebombing campaign required logistical preparations that staggered even American industrial capacity. Each major raid consumed thousands of tons of incendiary bombs. The M69 incendiaries had to be manufactured, shipped across the Pacific and stockpiled at forward bases. B-29 bombers required constant maintenance after the stress of low-altitude combat missions. Aircrew had to be rotated to prevent exhaustion. The entire operation demanded resources on a scale that would have been impossible for any other nation on Earth in 1945. The Japanese government watched these preparations with growing alarm. Intelligence reports indicated that American bomber strength in the Marianas was increasing steadily. New airfields were being constructed to handle even larger bomber formations. Most ominously, the pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't a single devastating raid followed by a return to conventional bombing. This was the beginning of a sustained campaign designed to systematically eliminate Japanese urban civilization. On May 13, 1945, 472 B-29s struck Nagoya in broad daylight, demonstrating that American tactical innovations were continuing to evolve. The raid destroyed over 3 square miles of the city and killed thousands more, civilians. But the daylight attack revealed something even more troubling for Japanese defenders. American bomber formations were now so large and well-coordinated that they could overwhelm Japanese air defenses even without the cover of darkness. The mathematics of aerial combat were becoming hopeless. Japan could intercept individual bombers, but they lacked the fighter strength to meaningfully contest formations of several hundred aircraft. The systematic destruction continued with relentless efficiency. Osaka was hit repeatedly throughout May and June. Each raid eliminated additional square miles of residential and industrial areas. Kobe's port facilities were reduced to rubble. Yokohama's waterfront districts were consumed in massive fires. The pattern was always the same. American bombers would arrive in overwhelming numbers, drop thousands of tons of incendiaries, and leave behind square miles of ash and tens of thousands of casualties. What made this campaign particularly devastating was its psychological warfare component. Beginning in July, American bombers began dropping leaflets over Japanese cities before attacking them. These leaflets warned civilians that their city would be bombed in the coming days and advised them to evacuate immediately. The warning served multiple purposes. They created panic and mass evacuations that disrupted Japanese society and war production. They demonstrated American confidence that Japanese air defenses couldn't prevent the announced attacks. Most importantly, they forced Japanese civilians to confront the reality that their government couldn't protect them. The leaflet drops created chaos throughout Japan. When American bombers announced that specific cities would be attacked, mass evacuations began immediately. Trains leaving targeted cities were packed beyond capacity. Roads filled with refugees carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Local governments struggled to provide food and shelter for hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians. The mere threat of bombing was paralyzing entire regions of the country. 6 cities received warning leaflets on July 27th. The next day, American bombers attacked every one of them exactly as promised. Aomori, Ichinomiya, Tsu, Uji Yamada, Ogaki, and Uwajima were systematically destroyed on schedule. The precision of these announced attacks sent a terrifying message to the Japanese government. American bomber forces were now so powerful, and Japanese defenses so weak, that raids could be conducted according to predetermined timetables published in advance. The cumulative effect of months of sustained bombing was devastating Japanese society at every level. Over 180 square miles of urban area had been destroyed across 67 different cities. More than 300,000 civilians were dead and another 400,000 injured. Millions more were homeless, creating a refugee crisis that overwhelmed Japan's remaining infrastructure. War production had collapsed as factories were destroyed and workers fled to the countryside. Transportation networks were disrupted by the constant movement of refugees and the destruction of urban rail and road systems. The psychological impact was equally profound. Japanese public opinion polls revealed the collapse of civilian morale with mathematical precision. In June 1944, only 2% of Japanese civilians believed they would lose the war. By December 1944, this figure had risen to 10%. In June 1945, as the firebombing campaign reached its peak intensity, 46% of the population expected defeat. By August, 68% of Japanese civilians believed the war was lost. The bombing hadn't just destroyed cities, it had destroyed the Japanese people's faith in their government's ability to protect them or achieve victory. The economic consequences were equally catastrophic. Japanese industrial production had collapsed under the combined effects of bombing damage and workforce displacement. In cities that hadn't been bombed, war production remained at 94% of peak levels. But in bombed cities, production fell to just 27% of previous capacity. The loss wasn't just from destroyed factories. It came from workers who had fled to rural areas, from disrupted supply chains, from the diversion of resources to firefighting and refugee assistance. The fishing industry, critical for Japanese food supply, had been devastated. The 1945 catch was only 22% of 1941 levels due to the destruction of port facilities and fishing fleets. The rice harvest was the worst since 1909, partly because agricultural workers had been pressed into firefighting and reconstruction efforts in bombed cities. Hunger and malnutrition became widespread as Japan's food distribution system collapsed under the pressure of mass displacement and infrastructure destruction. Perhaps most significantly, the bombing campaign had eliminated Japan's ability to disperse war production as a defense against air attack. The strategy of spreading manufacturing across thousands of small workshops in residential areas had been rendered useless. American bombers were now systematically destroying the residential areas themselves, making dispersal a liability rather than an asset. Japan's entire approach to wartime production had been invalidated by American industrial capacity to produce unlimited quantities of incendiary weapons. The Japanese government's attempts to respond to the crisis revealed their growing desperation. Millions of civilians were conscripted for firefighting duties, further reducing the workforce available for war production. Massive resources were diverted to constructing air raid shelters and fire breaks, projects that proved completely inadequate against the scale of American bombing. Emergency evacuation plans were developed for government officials and military headquarters, acknowledgement that nowhere in Japan was safe from attack. Military leaders who had once dismissed American bombing as ineffective were forced to confront devastating reality. The dispersed production strategy that was supposed to make Japanese industry invulnerable had instead made Japanese cities extremely vulnerable. The homeland that was supposed to be an impregnable fortress had become a collection of targets waiting to be systematically destroyed. The war economy that was supposed to sustain prolonged resistance was disintegrating under sustained aerial assault. The most telling indicator of Japanese recognition that defeat was inevitable came from the highest levels of government. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained largely removed from operational military decisions, began taking an increasingly active role in war planning. His tour of bombed areas in Tokyo had convinced him that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of Japanese civilization. Palace records from this period show the emperor asking detailed questions about American bombing capacity and Japanese defensive capabilities. The answers he received made clear that Japan had no effective response to sustained urban area bombing. By August 1945, the strategic situation had become mathematically hopeless for Japan. American bomber strength was increasing while Japanese defensive capacity diminished with each raid. The pattern was clear and irreversible. American industrial capacity could produce incendiary weapons faster than Japan could rebuild destroyed cities. American bomber production exceeded Japanese ability to replace lost defensive aircraft. American logistical systems could sustain this level of bombing indefinitely, while Japanese society was collapsing under the assault. The final demonstration of this overwhelming disparity came on the night of August 14th, less than 12 hours before Emperor Hirohito would announce Japan's surrender. American bombers struck Kumagaya, destroying 75% of the city and killing hundreds more civilians. This raid served as a brutal punctuation mark to the campaign, proving that American bombing would continue until the moment Japan formally capitulated. Even as surrender negotiations were concluding, American bombers were still systematically destroying Japanese cities according to predetermined schedules, duels. The targeting of Kumagaya on the eve of surrender revealed something profound about the psychological state of Japanese leadership. By August 1945, this wasn't random destruction or military necessity. It was a deliberate demonstration that American bombing capacity had become so overwhelming that raids could continue even as diplomatic negotiations were reaching their conclusion. Japanese officials understood the message clearly. American industrial might was so vast that ending the war required immediate capitulation, not gradual negotiation. The strategic bombing survey conducted after Japan's surrender would later conclude that the firebombing campaign alone had been sufficient to force Japanese surrender, even without the atomic bombs or Soviet invasion. This assessment was based on detailed interviews with surviving Japanese leaders and examination of government documents captured after the war. What emerged was a picture of complete strategic collapse, driven primarily by the systematic destruction of Japan's urban infrastructure. The mathematics were inescapable and had been clear to Japanese leadership for months. American bombers were destroying Japanese cities faster than they could be rebuilt or defended. War production was declining catastrophically as industrial areas were eliminated and workers fled to rural regions. The transportation system was breaking down under the pressure of mass refugee movements and infrastructure damage. Food distribution had collapsed as ports and rail networks were systematically destroyed. Most critically, the psychological foundation of Japanese resistance had been shattered. The concept of the homeland as an inviolable sanctuary had been destroyed along with the cities themselves. Japanese civilians had watched their government prove incapable of protecting them from aerial assault. The promise that fighting spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages had been revealed as fantasy when confronted with American industrial capacity to produce unlimited quantities of destruction. The firebombing campaign had achieved something that years of Pacific Island battles had not. It had forced Japanese leadership to confront the reality that they were fighting an opponent whose industrial resources were effectively infinite compared to their own. The United States could sustain this level of destruction indefinitely, while Japanese society collapsed under the assault. There was no path to victory, no hope of negotiated settlement, no possibility of prolonged resistance. Emperor Hirohito's decision to intervene directly in surrender negotiations stemmed from his recognition that continued war meant the complete annihilation of Japanese civilization. The bombed areas he had toured in March had grown from 16 square miles of Tokyo to 180 square miles across dozens of cities by August. The trajectory was clear. American bombing would continue until nothing remained of urban Japan. The choice was between surrender and national extinction. The speed with which Japanese leadership moved from confidence to despair revealed how completely the firebombing campaign had altered their strategic calculations. In early 1945, many Japanese officials still believed they could inflict sufficient casualties on American forces to negotiate favourable peace terms. By August, those same officials understood that American bombing capacity made such resistance suicidal. The war had become a race between Japanese collapse and American mercy. The technical aspects of the bombing campaign had evolved throughout 1945 in ways that made Japanese resistance increasingly futile. Early raids had required careful planning and coordination to achieve maximum destruction. By summer, American bomber formations had become so large and efficient that devastating raids could be conducted almost routinely. The logistical system supporting these operations had reached industrial scale, with supply ships delivering thousands of tons of incendiary weapons monthly to Pacific air bases. Japanese attempts to adapt their defences had proven completely inadequate against this level of sustained assault. Fighter aircraft were shot down faster than they could be replaced. Anti-aircraft guns were destroyed along with the cities they were supposed to defend. Fire departments were overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the blazes. Evacuation procedures broke down as entire populations attempted to flee simultaneously. Every defensive measure had been rendered obsolete by the sheer magnitude of American bombing capacity. The dispersal strategy that Japanese planners had considered their greatest strength had become their most critical vulnerability. Spreading war production throughout residential areas was supposed to make it impossible for enemy bombers to eliminate Japanese manufacturing capability. Instead, it had provided American planners with targets that could be attacked using area bombing techniques, specifically designed to destroy residential neighborhoods. The strategy had backfired catastrophically. The refugee crisis created by sustained bombing had paralyzed Japanese society in ways that went far beyond simple destruction. Millions of displaced civilians required food, shelter, and medical care that the government couldn't provide. Transportation systems were clogged with evacuees, preventing the movement of military supplies and personnel. Agricultural regions were overwhelmed by urban refugees, disrupting food production. The social fabric of the nation was disintegrating under pressure that exceeded anything in Japanese historical experience. The propaganda effect of the advance warning system had been particularly devastating to Japanese morale. When American bombers announced that specific cities would be attacked and then destroyed them exactly as promised, it demonstrated complete American confidence in their bombing capability. More importantly, it showed Japanese civilians that their government was powerless to prevent announced attacks. The warnings transformed bombing raids from military operations into public demonstrations of Japanese helplessness. The economic data collected after the war revealed the true extent of damage inflicted by the bombing campaign. Japanese war production had declined by over 60% in bombed areas. Critical industries like aircraft manufacturing had been reduced to less than 20% of peak capacity. The transportation network that connected industrial regions had been so severely damaged that remaining factories couldn't receive raw materials or ship finished products. The entire war. Economy was collapsing under sustained aerial assault. The human cost extended far beyond immediate casualties from the raids themselves. Malnutrition had become widespread as food distribution systems failed. Disease was spreading rapidly in overcrowded refugee centres. Medical facilities had been destroyed along with the cities, leaving millions without access to basic healthcare. The social structure that had sustained Japanese society throughout the war was fragmenting under pressure that exceeded its capacity to adapt. Japanese military leaders who had once believed in the possibility of decisive homeland defense were forced to acknowledge that their calculations had been fundamentally flawed. They had underestimated American industrial capacity by orders of magnitude. They had overestimated Japanese defensive capabilities. They had failed to anticipate the psychological impact of systematic urban destruction on civilian morale. Every assumption underlying Japanese strategy had been proven wrong by the reality of sustained strategic bombing. The intelligence reports reaching Japanese government officials painted an increasingly hopeless picture of their strategic situation. American bomber strength in the Pacific was continuing to increase with no apparent upper limit. New aircraft types were entering service that could carry larger bomb loads over greater distances. The production of incendiary weapons was accelerating rather than slowing. There was no indication that American bombing capacity would decline, or that the United States lacked the will to continue the campaign indefinitely. The diplomatic implications were equally stark. The systematic destruction of Japanese cities had eliminated any possibility of negotiating from a position of strength. American leaders had demonstrated their ability to destroy Japanese civilization without requiring a costly invasion. Why would they accept anything other than unconditional surrender when they could achieve complete victory through continued bombing? The leverage that Japanese diplomats had hoped to gain through prolonged resistance had evaporated along with their cities. The final weeks before surrender saw Japanese leadership grappling with the recognition that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They had planned for a conflict where fighting spirit and tactical skill could compensate for material disadvantages. Instead, they found themselves in a war where American industrial capacity could overwhelm any level of resistance through sheer volume of destruction. The rules of warfare had changed, and Japan had no answer to the new reality. The moment when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender represented the culmination of a campaign that had proven the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. The firebombing hadn't just destroyed Japanese cities. It had demonstrated that American productive power was so vast that resistance was mathematically impossible. The war had become a contest between Japanese determination and American industrial might, and industrial might had won decisively. The lessons learned from the firebombing campaign would reshape strategic thinking for decades to come. The ability to destroy enemy cities from the air had proven more decisive than traditional military victories. Industrial capacity had emerged as the ultimate arbiter of modern conflicts. The protection of civilian populations had become impossible against opponents with sufficient bombing capability. These realizations would define strategic planning throughout the Cold War era and beyond. Beyond. The aftermath of Japan's surrender revealed the true scope of what the firebombing campaign had accomplished. When American occupation forces entered Japanese cities in September 1945, they found urban landscapes that resembled moonscapes more than human habitation. Entire districts had been reduced to fields of ash, punctuated by twisted metal and concrete foundations. The destruction was so complete that occupation planners had to revise their estimates of Japan's remaining industrial capacity downward by enormous margins. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the occupation forces, toured the bombed cities and reported findings that stunned even American military leaders who had planned the campaign. Tokyo's eastern districts, which had housed over 1 million people before March 1945, contained virtually no intact structures across 16 square miles. Osaka's industrial core had been so thoroughly destroyed that American engineers estimated it would take a decade to rebuild basic infrastructure. The port facilities at Kobe were damaged beyond immediate repair, effectively cutting off Western Japan from maritime commerce. But the most revealing discoveries came from captured Japanese government documents that detailed the internal deliberations leading to surrender. These records showed that Japanese leadership had been tracking American bombing capacity with increasing alarm throughout 1945. Intelligence estimates prepared for Emperor Hirohito in July calculated that American forces could maintain their current rate of urban destruction indefinitely. The projections were mathematically devastating. At the pace established by summer 1945, every major Japanese city would be reduced to ash within 6 months. The captured documents revealed something even more significant about Japanese strategic thinking in the final months of the war. Military planners had concluded that defending against American bombing was impossible with available resources. Japanese fighter production had fallen to fewer than 200 aircraft per month by July 1945, while American bomber formations were destroying more than that number in defensive aircraft during single large raids. The mathematics of air defense had become hopeless. Economic analyses prepared for the Japanese cabinet showed industrial production collapsing at an accelerating rate. The destruction of residential areas containing small workshops had eliminated the dispersed manufacturing network that Japanese planners had considered their secret weapon against precision bombing. Instead of protecting Japanese industry by spreading it throughout civilian areas, this strategy had made civilian areas themselves into legitimate military targets for area bombing. The refugee crisis had grown to proportions that threatened the basic functioning of Japanese society. By August 1945, over 8 million Japanese civilians had been displaced from their homes by bombing or the threat of bombing. Rural areas that had never been intended to support large populations were overwhelmed by urban evacuees. Agricultural production declined as farmers were pressed into service supporting refugees. The transportation system struggled under the burden of constant population movements. Food distribution had reached crisis levels even before the atomic bombs were dropped. The 1945 rice harvest was projected to be the worst in decades, partly because agricultural workers had been diverted to firefighting and reconstruction efforts in bombed cities. The fishing industry, which provided critical protein for Japanese diets, had been devastated by the destruction of port facilities and fishing fleets. Malnutrition was becoming widespread in urban areas that hadn't been bombed, as food supplies were diverted to refugee centres. The psychological impact of the bombing campaign extended far beyond the physical destruction. Japanese civilians who had been taught that their homeland was an impregnable fortress watched American bombers operate with complete impunity over their cities. The advance warning system made this humiliation even more complete. When American leaflets announced that specific cities would be bombed, and then those cities were destroyed exactly as promised, it demonstrated that Japanese air defenses were completely ineffective. Public opinion surveys conducted secretly by Japanese government agencies revealed the collapse of civilian morale in stark statistical terms. The percentage of Japanese civilians who believed the war was lost had increased from 2% in early 1944 to over 60% by August 1945. More significantly, when asked what factors most influenced their assessment of the war situation, over half cited air raids as the primary reason for expecting defeat. The bombing had achieved something that military defeats in distant Pacific islands had not. It had convinced the Japanese people themselves that victory was impossible. The impact on Japanese military morale was equally profound. Soldier letters intercepted by American intelligence showed that troops were increasingly concerned about the safety of their families in bombed cities. Desertion rates increased throughout 1945 as soldiers received news that their homes had been destroyed and their relatives killed or displaced. The promise that fighting for the homeland would protect families had been revealed as false when the homeland itself became the primary battleground. Japanese attempts to counter the bombing campaign had consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. Millions of civilians were conscripted for firefighting duties, reducing the workforce available for war production. Massive construction projects were undertaken to build underground shelters and fire breaks, diverting materials and labour from military priorities. Fighter aircraft were kept in the home islands for air defence, rather than being deployed to combat zones where they might have been more effective. The strategic bombing survey conducted after the war included extensive interviews with Japanese officials who had participated in surrender negotiations. These interviews revealed that Emperor Hirohito's decision to seek peace had been driven primarily by his recognition that continued bombing would result in the complete destruction of Japanese civilization. The emperor had personally toured bombed areas and witnessed devastation that exceeded anything in Japanese historical experience. Finance Minister Kenji Ueda provided particularly detailed testimony about the economic factors that influenced the surrender decision. His calculations showed that Japanese war production would collapse entirely by early 1946 if bombing continued at current rates. The transportation network was so damaged that raw materials couldn't reach remaining factories. The workforce was so disrupted by displacement and casualties that maintaining production schedules had become impossible. The economy was entering a death spiral that could only be reversed by ending the war. Military leaders interviewed after the war acknowledged that their strategic assumptions had been fundamentally flawed. They had planned for a defensive campaign that would inflict such heavy casualties on American invasion forces that the United States would accept a negotiated peace. The bombing campaign had eliminated this possibility by demonstrating that America could achieve victory without invasion. Why would American leaders risk hundreds of thousands of casualties in an amphibious assault when they could destroy Japan's capacity to resist through continued bombing? The most damaging admission came from General Yoshijiro Umesu, Chief of the Army General Staff, who testified that Japanese military leaders had completely underestimated American industrial capacity. They had assumed that the resource requirements for sustained strategic bombing would force the United States to reduce the intensity of attacks over time. Instead, American bombing capability had increased throughout 1945 while Japanese defensive capacity diminished. The trajectory was clear and irreversible. The firebombing of Japan stands as perhaps the most decisive demonstration of industrial warfare's brutal mathematics in human history. In less 6 months, American bombers had reduced 180 square miles of Japanese cities to ash, killed over 300,000 civilians, and displaced millions more. But the true victory wasn't measured in square miles, destroyed, or casualties inflicted. It was measured in the moment when Emperor Hirohito himself acknowledged that continued resistance meant national extinction. The campaign had proven that in modern warfare, industrial capacity trumps fighting spirit every time. When American factories could produce incendiary weapons faster than Japan could rebuild its cities, when American logistics could sustain bombing indefinitely while Japanese society collapsed under assault, the outcome became mathematically inevitable. The fires that consumed Tokyo on March 9, 1945, had illuminated a terrible new reality. Wars would now be won not by the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the side that could produce more destruction than their opponent could endure.